We've got a reasonably sized collection of vinyl records and needed a new shelf to put them on. I wanted to make something that was kind of mid-century modern but not totally, and would really stand out. I also decided to make it out of white oak. Like most of my projects, this one started with stock prep. The first real part of construction was edge gluing up some panels to be the top, bottom, and sides. I settled on a sort of trapezoidal design which required some pretty precisely cut angles. The upper corners are 80 degrees on the inside while the lower corners are 100 degrees. Cutting the miters on the lower corners wasn't a problem, but cutting the upper corners required some engineering. Because the overall interior angle is 80 degrees, that means that both corresponding mitered angles are 40 degrees. To achieve those 40-degree miters, I would have to have the saw set at 50 degrees relative to the corner of the board. The problem is, I don't have any saws that can cut past 45 degrees. So to be able to achieve that 50-degree angle, I needed to change the orientation of the saw. By positioning the saw in such a way that the blade, when zeroed out, would already be at 45 degrees relative to the corner of the board, I would only have to add an additional 5 degrees to get my full 50-degree angle. So to achieve that, I built this jig. It's just a precise 45-degree wedge that can be attached to the workpiece tightly and also holds the track saw very well. I made it out of some plywood scraps in about 45 minutes. Since this got my saw started already at 45 degrees, I only had to set the saw to 5 degrees and then make my cut. This worked really well. After cutting the miter on both the top and side, I ended up with a perfect 80-degree interior angle. For the lower corners, I needed to set the saw to 40 degrees, which would give me 50-degree miters and not require any sort of jig. After cutting all the bottom miters, I ended up with a perfect 100-degree interior angle. Mitered corners are not especially strong joints, so I reinforced these with dominoes. All the dominoes that I had on hand were actually a little too long for this joint, so I just trimmed some down. I had to take it slowly, but with some rubber mallet action, the corners fit together pretty tight. The horizontal centerpiece is just a 3/4 inch thick board with some 80-degree bevels on the ends. To attach this piece to the sides though, I wanted to use dominoes, and to do that I needed to make this little jig so I could properly orient the tool. This little shelf made the perfect horizontal surface to hold the domino joiner as I made the cuts. One of the last things to do before assembly was to cut out some rabbets for the back panel to sit into. I didn't film it, but I also took this time to cut a dado in the top and in the horizontal centerpiece for the eventual lighting that I'll install later in the video. Then the last step before glue up was sanding the interior surfaces. Assembling this thing was honestly a giant pain in the butt. I used Type Bond 3 because I knew I was going to need the longer open time on the glue. I also eventually kind of got annoyed with the camera being in my way, so I put that away so I could concentrate. After maybe 15 or 20 minutes, I finally got it all together, and with the help of some 5,000-pound cargo straps, it was glued up. Because I wanted to illuminate the shelves with absolutely no exposed wiring, the vertical supports weren't as simple as you'd think. 2 of them are just solid boards, but the other 2 have hollow spaces for wiring, one with a battery pack and the other with a switch. I didn't want the hollow ones to appear to be laminated, so I made these little end caps so that the grain would appear continuous. These pieces will be the exposed front surfaces of the parts that contain the wiring. I needed to make little access panels, one to house a battery and the other one to hold the switch. To make the cleanest cuts possible, this is how I did it. This was actually my second attempt at making one of these holes. The first time I used a jigsaw and a spindle sander and it did not go well. I'm only adding basic illumination to this piece to make it easier to find records. My intention isn't to leave the lights on for extended periods of time. I also didn't want to make a piece of furniture that had to be plugged into the wall, and that's why it's going to have a battery pack. Because I'm only using low voltage LED strip lights, a small 12-volt battery will be more than enough to power them. And the battery is also small enough to fit inside a 3/4 inch thick board. This may seem like ridiculous lengths to go to add some lights to a cabinet, but it's something I wanted to try and I really hate exposed wiring. Since the battery will eventually have to be replaced, I wanted to make it fairly easy to access. A screwed-on access panel would have worked fine, but I wanted to make one with hinges and a little magnetic catch. Getting these hinges in properly was a lot harder than it should have been. I actually ended up doing this a second time to fix some alignment issues and to put in pilot holes because the wood split without them. I'm not gonna lie, I'm pretty proud of this stupid little door. These pieces are made out of laminated 1/4 inch slices of white oak. When put together, they look almost like solid pieces. After they were fully assembled, I added little grooves to the tops and bottoms. These will facilitate small tongues that I'll use to both align and attach the vertical supports to the rest of the cabinet. Before I could install the hollow supports, I needed to cut a hole in the horizontal shelf for the wiring to pass through. This was literally my first try at seeing how easy it would be to get a wire to feed through. With that test a success, I glued in the vertical supports. This was kind of done as an afterthought, but I needed to add one more horizontal element to serve as the lower support for the top drawer. I don't really like using pocket screws in furniture construction, but to get this shelf in, this was the best and easiest way to do it. For the legs, I started by laminating up a lot of the offcuts. Each of the legs are made from 2 separate pieces that meet together to form a 100-degree angle. These 2 parts then got dominoed together. I cut out the basic shape on the bandsaw. At this point, I was planning on using the router table to clean these up, but the pieces were actually too thick for my tallest bit. Since the router table was out, I cleaned up the curves with the edge sander. After everything was finished sanded, the legs were glued onto the outside of the cabinet. Since vinyl records are pretty heavy, I added a small center foot to support the middle and prevent sagging. I'm not going to get too in-depth on how I made the drawers because there's already an entire video devoted just to that, link in the upper right-hand corner. Because I wanted to use box joints, and due to the shape of the drawers, I had to do it all by hand. People who are really good at this sort of thing probably skip straight ahead to using the saws, but I'm not that good, so I have to establish knife walls first. Even though I'm kind of rusty with hand tool work, I'm pretty happy with how these came out. I used rabbet joints for the back panels because they would never be seen. After I made the drawer boxes, I glued in little support strips that the drawer bottoms would rest on. Making the single cabinet door was a lot easier. For hinges, I chose some soft closing Euro style that were made for a full inset door. After I finished installing the door, I added a little stop into the upper right hand corner. I really couldn't find any commercial handles that I liked, so I decided to make my own. I decided to mimic all the angles that the cabinet was made out of for the handles. Once the handles were done, I installed them on the drawers and door with screws. I really wanted to add splines to the upper miters on the cabinet solely as decoration. The dominoes on their own added more than enough strength to the joint as it was. To cut the splines, I made this jig. It allows me to use the plunge router with a straight cut 1/4 inch wide bit and a bearing collar. I made this jig in about an hour, and it's intended to be pretty much single use. I don't know how often I'd be making anything with 80-degree corners. Here's how the jig works. It's just precisely lined out slots with bearing guides. The underside is beveled right down the middle with support set at 80 degrees. It's the exact width of my cabinet and is made to clamp right over the corner. Here you can see what the underside looks like when installed on the top and bottom. And on the router I installed an upper bearing guide. To prevent any chip out on use, I came in from both sides of the joint. After I cut the slots, I glued in the splines. And lastly, I flush trimmed and sanded the joint smooth. And once the splines were done, I didn't need the jig anymore. To finish the shelf, I used Rubio Monocoat Oak. Right out of the can, the finish is kind of a sickly green, but it really does come out nice. I really like Rubio products because I can do all the finishing in a day instead of several, and it doesn't look plasticky. With all the finishing done, I moved on to wiring the lights. Because of my size requirements, I had to use a very small switch. This was actually made for things like flashlights. I soldered leads onto the switch and then ran the wires through to where the battery pack would go. Next, I routed the wire that would go to the top sectional lights. In case it isn't obvious, I did this with the cabinet turned upside down. This wire connects the strip lights for the upper part of the cabinet. The part on the right that doesn't have any lights is where the drawers go. If you're interested in doing LED strip lights, I get much more into it in my illuminated custom closet build, link in the upper right hand corner. Next, I installed the 2 strips of lights that go on the lower shelf. All the connections were soldered together and covered with heat shrink. It was a tight fit, but with all the wires tucked away, the battery fit perfectly. Lastly, I installed the upper switch panel and the illumination was done. As the penultimate step, I cut up some scrap 1/4-inch plywood that I had to make the back panels. I trimmed them with some fake leather. To attach to the leather, I put contact cement on the plywood side and used spray adhesive on the leather side. Once all the panels that needed it were covered, I attached them to the back of the cabinet. I also trimmed out the drawer bottoms with the fake leather. To make this easy, I glued the leather to some poster board substrates. By gluing the leather to the poster board, now it has enough rigidity that gluing the entire thing into the drawer is much easier. And with that final step, this piece was done. I spent a lot of time kind of hemming and hawing over this design, but I'm really happy with how it came out. And I really like how the lighting came out. It definitely makes finding the right album easier. If you made it this far, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.